existence of God, something to that effect. Would that be like would that be
Yeah, so
your
my
position?
position as a Christian is that you can't actually justify certain metaphysical things like morality. Obviously, we're not talking about morality, but logic, truth, knowledge, how you, even knowing reality itself. Um, you would lack the necessary preconditions for knowledge, and knowledge being belief in what's true, because it would require you to know what is true. It would require you to know, well, to be even have the ability to know things about reality. So my position is that unless you start with God, or unless you have God, you cannot justify any knowledge, and therefore, I think it would follow that you don't actually know anything.
Okay, so you essentially think that atheism is going to entail some kind of like epistemic nihilism. So let's get started with kind of understanding the criteria for a a successful justification of such things. Um, and you can start wherever you want. What are the set criteria for like what's the threshold, the metric by which you're going to measure once a system reaches crosses the threshold of counting as knowledge? Like what are the metrics?
Uh well, in order to have knowledge, the thing has you have to actually believe it, which is why I sort of reject determinism as just being basically people just spouting off hot air. Like if they had to say the thing they said, then they don't actually believe it. So I would argue they don't have knowledge, but it crosses the threshold when your knowledge is obviously it's belief, but it has to be true. So we have to have the ability to actually know what's true or what's real. If you agree that that is what truth is.
Yeah, so I mean, depending on like the definition of truth you're working with, are you talking about like a correspondence sense, or do you like lean in a different direction as
Yeah,
far as truth goes? Like, what theory of truth do you use?
correspondence.
So
Yeah,
some kind of
correspondence. My
correspondence.
argument is that the atheist, well, actually, any position that is divorced or separate from the Christian God would inevitably be led to some sort of logical inconsistencies. It would be logically incoherent. It wouldn't be defensible, and that's why usually, if I'm debating an atheist, I want them to stick with the atheist position, just because uh, if they want to accept another worldview or posit a God for knowledge, then it's going to require them to basically jump ship, jump the atheist ship. So I'm just trying to figure out if there is a way to account for knowledge separate from God.
Okay,
And
and
I
then
kind of do
let's.
that with a dialectic, I guess.
What are the success criteria for justifying those things? Like, what does it mean to justify it, and how do we know once it's actually been successfully justified? Like, what's the point at which boom we check off justification? Where's that line at?
What do you mean when it's justified? You mean when it's real? Like, how do you know if it's real?
No, no, no. So presumably, like I think that like knowledge is going to be something about justified true belief, right? So you've got the belief criteria. We have to actually assent to the propositions. My position on belief, truth. You're wanting to use some kind of correspondence theory, which I'm fine with, and then justification. What's your theory of justification, and at what point do we check mark the justification criteria? So like usually the contention from uh, the two main contentions from presuppositional apologists is that you're going to need some sort of like revelational epistemology in order for you to know what is actually true, and then the justification criteria is a little bit more wishy-washy, and so I'm trying to understand what do you when is it checked off? When have you said, okay, I agree with you, you have correctly justified this? What's that line? Where's that line at?
Man, I really wish I knew what you were saying. I'm not trying to be like off-putting by it, but what do you mean? I guess,
Well, okay, so like let's say for instance I
I
claim
mean,
you
I say
can't
yes. So, I mean, if we could talk about reality, then there must be some sort of justification going on, right?
well, yeah, so but the question is so say for instance I give you a proposition that I'm aware of. So I say something like, I see a bear, and it's the case, it's true. I'm in fact seeing a bear. Uh,
Uh-huh.
I believe it, so I assent to it, and now I need to justify it. So let's say, for instance, I give you some things that are reason giving to believe that I am in fact seeing a bear. Like for instance, um, you know, in my vision, there seems to be this object. The object
Sure.
has the same topology of the things what we call a bear. It seems to have the same sort of physiology as the bear.
Yeah,
Um,
so I don't know if it's
my
necessarily
experience.
always the point that you have to justify it, because eventually, if we're talking like criterion, um, eh, when I ask somebody what's their ultimate criterion for knowledge or how they know anything or for what's true, that's going to be necessarily self-justifying. Like, when we say knowledge requires belief, or justified belief, sometimes I don't think it. Maybe it doesn't. I just think it believes that you have to believe in what's true. The question comes down to how do you know what's true? How do you know what's real? And so, because when you say we have to justify it, you're kind of you're kind of saying that you're taking it for granted its truthness already. So, like, because if it wasn't true, could you? I mean, could you justify it? So, how do you know it's actually true before you can justify it?
So if I just happenstantially have a belief that there's a pebble of gold on the opposite side of the moon, I don't know how it got there. I've never seen it. I have no reasons to believe that it's true, but I do assent to the proposition there's a pebble of gold on the opposite side of the moon. Do I have knowledge in your view?
How do you determine if it is true?
Well, the question is if it is true happenstantially and I assent to it, do I have knowledge? So those two things in tandem were what it seemed like you were saying was knowledge. Because if you take out like the justification
Yeah.
criteria, then it's just true belief. So happenstantially, it's true, um, and I believe it. Is that knowledge?
Yeah, I'd say I'd say that's knowledge, but it would require you to know what is true. So, I mean, how do you know when it's true, or how do you even know it's
So
real? You know what I mean?
So, as an example, you would have to be committed to then that atheists can never know any given truth ever. And when we say knowing any given truth, it just needs to, it can happenstantially be true, and I believe it, and then I have knowledge. So, like, say for instance, something really simplistic would be like access to my own experience. Like, of course, I have like this special access to my own experience in a way that there's no one else that has that access because that's part of what it means to be me. And if I can know something, say for instance, a priori, right? So like it's true that 2 plus 2 is 4, and that's just true in virtue of meaning, right? And I believe it, even if I don't have like some sort of like justification for 2 plus 2 being 4, it would
Uh,
count in your view as knowledge, and so it would be false that atheism wouldn't be able to have knowledge, right? So if that's the criterion, it's a very low threshold for the criterion. It seems strange that you would ever believe that atheists couldn't have knowledge if that was your criterion.
if they can account for how they know what's real, I mean, if they can't even do that, then even that claim itself is kind of meaningless. Because you say experience, like, are you saying you know things through your experience then, or?
So, well, just of the experience itself, not the experience like the not my experience of the spatiality around me. I'm just talking about like a priori things. So, like I'm thinking of number two, and in virtue of that number being meaning what I mean when I intend the term two, the term addition, adding another thing to that thing, and again that's the same thing in number two. In virtue of those two things, I can know that a priori 2 plus 2 is 4. Now you mentioned just now something about like accounting for it. Now accounting for it's going to be something about justification, but we just a moment ago we denied that justification was going to be a criteria for what you considered to be knowledge because it
Oh,
just
no, no,
needs
no.
to
I'm
be
not
true,
saying that.
happenstantially or otherwise.
I'm not talking like justification in the sense that they just have this kind of accidental knowledge, which I mean, I would probably still call knowledge. I mean, if I ask you how you knew something, you're going to justify knowing it with presumably something else. Usually, atheists are going to jump to their senses, and then that would require further justification. Like, how do you know your senses are valid, or how do you know your reasoning's valid? Stuff like that.
Well, that's the question I was asking before, right? So, what is the threshold? At what point does the metric stop, and you say you agree I have correctly justified that? Where does that stop? Where you would finally say, okay, that the metric that is justification, they've accounted for it. That's check mark. What is that? So like presumably, if your worldview can do this, you should know what the criterion is. And if you don't know what the criterion is, then how would you ever know whether or not another worldview could do it?
Because if you couldn't have knowledge at all, then I mean, even simple refutations wouldn't make sense to even make. Like, the way I'm trying to use what you said, how you phrased it, because I'm still trying to interpret what you're saying. I'm not trying to say you're saying it wrong or something. I'm trying to figure out how, if we do know things, how does the atheist position justify saying we know things? Obviously, I'm going to appeal to God. I'm going to say God makes us certain of our reasoning and senses. He makes us know things. Because I think in order to justify any knowledge claim, you'd have to have infinite knowledge or have revelation for someone who does. And if there's a way out of that, uh, or you could just reject that you wouldn't need infinite knowledge.
So the question, what I'm asking, is essentially this. So presumably, you think that when you appeal to God, He somehow manages to successfully meet the criterion that we would call justification, right? So you've got this. You think of it like a checkbox. You got a checklist. This is what it means for a worldview to justify knowledge, right? So like I have the correct justification. Okay, well, do I commit myself to something like every justification needs a justification, right? So like if that's the case, then God would need a justification as well. You'd keep on going back. And my question is where does the buck stop? What's the point where you check off, cool, that's justified? Now, presumably, God, being a member set of your worldview, has something that He uniquely checks in that set that nobody
Yeah,
else can get. And so I'm asking, what is that
yeah,
thing that God is checking off?
he makes us know things.
Well, that's just going to beg the question, right? That's circular.
Well, I mean, I mean, that's how we know things is essentially because God gives us certainty of our reasoning and senses. I mean, say when is it checked off? I mean, if you think it can never be checked off, then you have to abandon knowledge altogether,
So
right?
so essentially the question that I'm asking is presumably God is not just making you know things. It's not as simple as He's making you know things. The method and the way in which He's making you know things is what I'm asking about. Because you're gonna need something unique that God is doing and that only God allows for, that lets
Yeah,
Him check the justification box. Now if you say it's just that
he
He's
has infinite
God and
knowledge.
He's just making us know things. Okay, so God having infinite knowledge.
Yes.
So um in order to know things, um, you're going to need to be able to justify them, right? So God's going to need to justify those things too, right? So how does God check off that box? Does He have a God too?
Well, he created everything, so he knows everything.
I'm just asking, like, if you're giving me this task, like I have to have in order to have knowledge, I have to have a God. So
You don't
if
have to worship this God. You don't have to even profess his name. But the reason you can say things intelligibly is not because of some system that you can justify. You'd have to appeal to something higher that has infinite. You call it whatever you want, but I'm going to ask you if it has infinite knowledge and if it's all powerful. Um, then I mean, we just agreed that yeah, that's God. But that wouldn't be. I mean, that wouldn't obviously you can't take that position if you're an atheist. Um, so
in this
I'm saying
I'm objecting to the criterion set because I don't think that it makes a lot of sense. So if we say that knowledge is going to be this thing where we have like the standard kind of view is justified true belief.
yeah,
You sort of
I say
didn't
knowledge
think
is
that,
belief in what's true. And then my
but
question is, how do we know what's true? That's the next
but then
question.
but then you don't need the justification criterion,
Does it
right?
have
So
to
then
be
there's not.
justified?
Yeah, that's the problem. So if it doesn't have to be justified,
Okay,
then I don't need to know if it doesn't have to be justified on your view. Like in your view, it just has to be true, and I have to assent to the
I justify it
proposition,
with
right?
God.
That's
I mean, the justification is that you can't justify any knowledge unless you had infinite knowledge. And since God has infinite knowledge, he justifies all the knowledge that we have. I mean, if you're saying it requires justification, but on what basis do you assume that it requires justification? Like, how do you know that?
well,
You know?
what I'm asking about is within your view. You said all you have to do is believe it and it has to be true, right? And I was like, but
Correct.
wait a second. I thought you said I needed to justify it. So if knowledge is just true belief and there's no justification, if that's the case, then that's one version of knowledge. Are we going with the JTB model, like
No.
knowledge is justified true belief, or are we just going with just true belief?
Uh, I don't know. Knowledge is true belief.
Okay, so if knowledge is true belief, then there's not a reason that I need to justify any of it, right?
If you
So
want to
God
make
wouldn't
knowledge
do anything.
in the context of me trying to figure out how you know things, you would, but I mean,
Well, but I don't
not
need to.
not walking down the
If
street,
it's
you wouldn't have
just
to.
if it's just like true belief, then there's not a reason that I would need to. to like explain to you how the way in which I know it, because the way in which I know it, like that criterion is part of the justification portion of knowledge. So usually the way knowledge is phrased is you have to have some kind of justification. Like me happenstantially having a belief that I assent to, like a proposition I assent to, so I believe it, and it just happens to be true, whether or not I'm aware of how I know it's true, or
I would argue
why
that even
it's true, or
unjustified true belief requires God, because in order to have unjustified true belief, like if you can't justify it, uh, then all you're left with is belief in what's true. And so you'd still have to show how you know what's true, how you know what's real, or you can't even have unjustified true belief because you'd be missing the true part. It would just be, I guess, neurons firing.
well,
Like
but even if it's
I
like
get like you want it
even
to
if
be
it's just
justified, but
neurons firing and I know that neurons are firing and that's true and I believe it, then that's going to fit the criterion for knowledge from your view, unless you have justification criteria. Like
you
if
can't
the
believe it
justification is
if all it is neurons firing. You cannot say that you believe it
why?
because you had to say it.
Mm, why would I have to say it if it's just neurons firing? Like if it's,
You had to say
I
it
don't
because
see.
because you did say it.
Like,
So what I'm saying
I
is if
mean,
you had to say
you think
something, then
you
you
can't believe things without saying it? Like you've never had like a belief you've never shared with somebody?
you can, but not for the reason that it's exclusively neurons firing. Because if that was the case, I'd say Mountain Dew knows things. You know what I mean? It's just a chemical reaction. There has to be some intentionality there, right?
I mean, Mountain Dew is it doesn't have neurons, but so I don't see
I
why
know it
it's
has. I'm
analogous.
saying, but why are neurons important versus carbohydrates fizzing around? I mean, what meaning are we attaching to that the neurons can firing randomly can somehow bring about belief? I would argue that if all you are is a bunch of brain fizz, then you can't actually know anything. But the
I
problem
don't
is we
see why
do
that
know
would follow.
things.
I mean, I don't see why
Um,
that would follow. There can be distinctions, like for instance, I mean,
do you think? Sure.
I don't think that like Mountain Dew is going to be analogous. I think that's like a very low ball sort of like in the same
Well,
way
if
that
I drop
I don't think steak is the equivalent of eating, grass, despite the fact that grass is going to be the thing that feeds the cow and that's the thing that makes the steak grow. It's like it's not going to be the case that even if they share
absolutely, that wouldn't make any.
some
That's right.
simplistic
It wouldn't make
properties,
any
there's not an
sense.
analogy. Well, there's just
Absolutely,
not an
it
analogy
would
between the
be.
two.
That's because it would be incoherent. It would be completely incoherent. I mean, to think that dropping a Mento and a Pepsi is knowledge, it would be crazy. So there has to be something more than uh, you know random
Well,
things moving.
maybe we should move because I thought you only wanted to talk about epistemology and not ontology. If you have a dualistic ontology, I can give you my objections. I don't think that a dualistic ontology can work. I think that it entails a contradiction. So if you think that mind is like this special substance, this special thing out there that's like fundamentally discontinuous with like physical material things or something like that,
Right.
I'm going to
Um,
reject that
It
position.
kind of it kind of stemmed back from when we were talking about like, does it have to be is unjustified true belief uh, even? I mean, is it a disqualifier of knowledge? Like, if I ask you, what is one thing you know, and how do you know it? That's kind of what
Well,
I mean by justify.
I know I'm
I mean, what
having an
would you say?
experience as a simple example. I know I'm having an experience.
How do you know that?
Well, so I don't. If it's the case
I'm
that
not trying to get you or anything. That I'll answer these
no,
questions too. I just that's just the diet. I
no,
have to ask the
it's
question
okay. I
now.
don't. I know you're not going for a gotcha. What I'm looking at though is it seems peculiar because when you ask how do you know that, that's the justification criterion. But you're saying you don't hold that in order to have knowledge that you have to justify it. It just has to be true, and I have to believe it, right? So it doesn't matter whether or not I can tell you the way in which I know that, right? From your view, at least, it wouldn't matter. So it'd be the case that if it's true I'm having an experience, which presumably you're also committed to that, God or no God, right? Like
Mhm.
you believe that maybe God is accounting for my experience or something to that effect, but you believe also that it's true that I'm having an experience, presumably because within your worldview, like we're not going to disagree on this topic, right? And then I believe those things too, so I'm assenting to the proposition. So I'm meeting the criterion for having knowledge unless you hold that there is a justification need. Now, if there is a justification need, what we need to do before we can really even talk about how to justify, like going into justifying it, we need to know what's the threshold, what's the where is the line that we draw that we say, cool, great, we both agree that one's justified. Um,
It has to
and
comport with reality.
that's it needs to comport with, well, that's being true though, right? That's the true component. So all it has to be the case is that it happenstantially is the case I'm having an experience and that I
Yeah.
believe it. And that would be knowledge. So do you agree that I am having an experience?
Yeah.
Okay. And I believe it.
Yeah.
So I have knowledge from your view.
Yeah, you would, but how do you know you're having an experience?
Well, that wouldn't be a member set of the criterion, right? Like you reject that you rejected that justification was like a component of knowledge. Do you
Okay,
remember?
we can add justification. You're right. We can add
Cool.
it back in.
Okay. No, I actually I think that justification is a criterion of knowledge. I find it
Sure.
kind of peculiar that anyone would ever toss it out. So before we can go into go like the how do we justify something like this, we need to know what is the metric, what's the measurement
Right.
to once we successfully
Exactly.
say,
How
let
do
me
you know when
check
it's
off what is justified.
right?
So
How do you know when it is justified? Right. What does
yeah,
justify mean? Uh, I think the first step would be you'd have to at least have some faculty to know what's real.
okay.
I guess what does this justify mean then? I guess what is the reason I didn't mean to divorce it like that to start off. But the reason I just left it out was because generally conversing with people that wasn't like a function we had to throw in there. But uh, yeah, if you want to call it justified, then it's going to require both of us to demonstrate how we know anything is justified. uh, which is just going to basically terminate justification because every reason you give is going to need a further justification. Which is why I say you will need to have infinite knowledge or give knowledge up completely, or have revelation from someone who does. Like, because every time we sit here and just talk about, like, well, we justified it now. Aha, great. Well, how do we justify that thing? Oh, we both agree that it justifies it. Okay, well, how do we justify this thing? It'll just go on forever. In fact, you couldn't you couldn't know anything. So that's why I said it does need justified like in a nominal like down to earth sense, but like once you get down to like the very final straws, you're gonna run out of being able to say it's justified. In fact,
Yeah,
if you reject that it's justified, you just have to give up knowledge completely and say, well, we don't know anything for certain.
that's the question that I'm asking. So as we dig down to the bottom of an epistemology, if we get to something at the bottom and say, for instance, that thing's going to need some set of qualities that make it successful in such a way that no other thing can do that. And so the question is what are the
Right.
qualities that you
It would
think
have
that has to have
it would
in
have to
order
know
for it
everything,
to achieve knowledge?
and it would have to have infinite knowledge, and it would have to have the ability to make you know things.
So
Otherwise,
this is going to
you
be
couldn't.
this is going to commit you to a weird kind of circularity, and it's going to be a very peculiar one because what's going to happen is you're going to say God has to know everything. But keep in mind, we just set the criterion for what knowledge is, which is that you're going to need to have something else that knows everything, right? God's going
I'm
to
saying
have to have a God,
I'm saying
and
since
that's
he's
going
the
to get
origin.
weird.
I'm saying since he's the origin of everything, uh, you would say this is circular reasoning. I would call it a virtuous circle because every criterion has to be self-justifying. Otherwise, you have to give up knowledge 100%.
Well, so that's not what I've explained this a few times on the server, and I don't know if the crowd is listening on many of my discussions, but that's not what virtuous circularity means. So
This is the
this is a type of circularity called essentially I think this one qualifies as concept circularity, which is not virtuous. So concept circularity is you're going to use the thing, God, having knowledge, to justify the thing in question having knowledge, right? So that's just concept circularity. That's not going to be virtuous circularity. Virtuous circularity is a type of paradigmatic circularity, where essentially within your own epistemology, internal to your system, if you take every node of knowledge that you have and you zoom out on your entire epistemic system, it's going to look like a giant web. This is the kind of circular justifications that like coherentists commit to. So it's not the case that you will have virtuous circularity. You wouldn't, anyways, which means you don't have knowledge. Um, Now you might say something like, "Well, that's the kind of knowledge God has. Is this like giant web of pieces of information inferentially related to one another, right?" But you wouldn't have that, so you wouldn't have knowledge by that criterion. If you require a virtuous circle in your epistemology, and it's just not the case that you would have knowledge. God would have knowledge by that virtue, but you wouldn't.
right.
Do you agree?
And I think he would still make me know things. I mean, I don't see the problem with it. I mean, are all instances of circularity necessarily like bad or vicious or fallacious? I mean, because you'd say you would
So
have to agree that any criterion is self-justifying, right? Because if there's something that
from my
justifies it,
view,
then that is the criterion.
so what I'm objecting to is that essentially, if what you're saying is you have to have this virtuous circle, right? Now, God would qualify for the topology of virtuous circle I just listed off, but your view wouldn't. So, like from your perspective, God couldn't even in principle make you know things without making you know everything because you wouldn't have that virtuous circle. So, and if that's the case, then you're committed to saying the Christian can't in principle have knowledge, only God can.
Why
Um,
is it that he would have
and
to absolutely make me know everything, though? Why can't he select,
because if the
what things
if the
to?
criterion for having knowledge is having access to knowing everything, right? And you don't know everything,
Not
then
th th okay, I see what you said, but I'll kind of rephrase it then. The criterion for having reliability of your senses and reasoning ever, comes from God. So not all knowledge, I guess.
so how is it that God goes about giving you reliability of such things? What does he do?
I don't know how he does it, but, and if he's not, then I can't know anything for certain.
Well, that's just not informed. So
Because you'd
if
have to
you don't know
justify your
how
senses and
God is
reasoning, and since
doing it,
I can't justify my senses and reasoning, really within my internal self. Like I said, in order to justify A, you'd have to say because of B. Why B because of C? Why C because of D? And that doesn't stop at Z. That stops ad infinitum. It goes on forever. So that's why I say you would have to have infinite knowledge, or have it revealed from someone who does. That just gives you, uh, support for your reasoning and your senses and stuff like that. Logic, and it's not debate topic. Morality would be one of them too. Metaphysical things, so that we can have, like, we have to use our senses and reasoning to even say, like, that something would be incomprehensible or not possible. Problem is, like, how do you know your reasoning is valid? You'd have to use your reasoning to defend it, which I say would be circular, um, which means it cannot be the justifier. Like, you would have to have infinite
so
knowledge.
let's take a simpler example where it might be easier to see what my objection is exactly. So the way in which you're saying that God is, giving us knowledge is he's somehow justifying without you knowing how he's doing so or what he's doing or what the behavior. He's somehow justifying things like logic or something really reasoning. How
He makes our
what in
reasoning reliable.
principle could God be doing that would be justifying reasoning or logic? What could he be doing?
He could be revealing things to us so that we can rely on our reasoning.
So it'd be something like um, premise one: God is revealing. If God exists, then God is revealing uh, to us in a way that revealing logic to us in a way that we could know that we can trust our reasoning. Premise two: God exists, therefore we can God is revealing to us the ability to trust our reasoning in a way that we can know that sort of thing. Would that be what you're trying to get at?
I don't know, to be honest with me. I don't know. If maybe you could restate that.
Okay, so essentially, if God exists, then God is revealing to us logic and reason in such a way that we can know that we can trust our logic and reason. Premise two: God exists. Conclusion: therefore, God is revealing to us.
Yeah,
Uh,
I
the,
think that's pretty comfortable. Yeah.
okay, so this is again an objectionable form of circularity, right? So like while some philosophers hold that there is one type of circularity, virtuous circularity, that they think works, this is not one of them, right? This is again concept circularity. So what you're trying to do is you're justifying logic using some sort of inferential reasoning, right? So God existing gives you reason to believe that you can trust your reasoning. But what's the thing in question if not your reasoning in that statement, right? So
That's
if
how
you're
I can do
using
it.
the thing in question, that's just concept circularity, and that is not virtuous.
I mean, what's the way out of it? That's my way out of the circle, is by appealing to the one who knows everything. Would you say it's impossible for God to exist?
Do I think it's impossible? Like, it depends on,
Yeah.
like, what kinda God you think, like a
Is
Trinitarian
it,
God? Yeah,
is
it's
it
absolutely
impossible for the
impossible.
is it impossible for the Christian God to exist?
Oh, no, no, it is not possible.
Is it impossible for him to reveal things to me so that I can have certainty?
If without existing, no, I don't see how I could do that, right?
I mean, well, you said it's not impossible. So is it impossible that God who reveals things to men so that they have certainty, is it impossible that that he could exist? If you say yes, then
Yeah.
you're gonna have to explain, what other way do you have, uh, just for sake of the debate, sake of argument, that you've justified absolutely anything at all. if it's impossible for that God to exist. I mean, okay, so how do you know anything for certain?
Well, I don't think that certainty is like a criterion of knowledge, right? We established the criterion earlier, which was justification, it
Do you
being
know
believed
anything at
by
all?
me and it being true. Well, yeah, I said I do think I know things, and I think that there's a success criterion that I don't think requires God, and I don't think that God even like fits any of the criterion. Like for instance, justifying something like logic or reason,
Yeah.
it doesn't even have the thing is justifying logic or reason doesn't even make sense because justification, like inferential relationships, are the thing in
Right,
question
you'd have
there,
to use
right? So
logic to
like if
do
you,
so, right. So you'd have to be able to either justify you'd have to use logic to do that. I agree that would be
hmm
equally absurd, but the problem is, uh, you do have these logical faculties, and you can use them. So it's like, well, we could justify logic using logic. That sounds a little bit weird, but it's kind of exposing that you do have these logical faculties to rely on to begin with. To even say that proving logic with logic would be absurd. So it's like,
Well, if we're
where
fine with like concept circularity, then we're just like at that point we're just going to accept lots and lots of types of circularity, right? So, like for instance, if I justify my faculties based on some aspect of my faculties, um,
right?
if I
I would
justify
ask you
my
why you would do
senses
that. You
based
would
on
ask,
something about what is it?
I'm sorry, I should cut you off.
Well, the idea is that once you commit to like accepting these very strange, peculiar versions of circularity, like concept circularity, then you're going to commit to like it's very simplistic and easy for basically anyone to know almost anything because now you're outside of the realm of virtuous circularity, right? This is no longer a virtuous circle. This is just going to be plain old concept circularity. Um, I'm going to justify concepts using concepts. Like for instance, I can justify logic using logic. There's not a reason why I couldn't do that from your view. Now, my view is that that doesn't make any sense. I think
That's
it's a
absolutely
case of a
right.
broken question.
Well,
Um,
I know that I think that'd be absolutely right, but it would require you to actually have proper reasoning and logical faculties to begin with, to even say that that would be crazy, that would be absurd. It's like, yeah, because you can use logic, and it's not justified in your system anywhere. So
well, but
that's why I say, like,
you're already using it in yours, right? So you're just assuming you have
well,
it,
I'm
you
saying
use
like,
it, and then you appeal to God, and it's like, but that doesn't really do anything. Like there's
I'm
not
saying
like
that
I
if
don't
you
see
want to,
why if we accept the type of circle that you're advocating for there, we can just cut out the middleman, right? We can just cut out God and go, no, just let's just toss that one aside, and let's just use plain old here's logic and reason. How do we justify it? Well, I think it's justified based on logic and reason, right? That it seems silly. I think that's not even. I think that one, your view is going to entail a contradiction here. So the contradiction goes something like this: if we're talking about justification, it's going to be something explanatory, and explanations are going to be informative. The reason that the type of circle that I'm objecting to here is problematic is because it's not informative, and if it's not informative, then it's not going to be explanatory, and therefore you have the contradiction. You've offered an
okay,
explanation that's not
that's fine.
explanatory.
I mean, so what is your criterion, your absolute criterion for knowledge for what's true?
I don't know what an absolute criterion is.
Like, what is the ultimate end all for saying this is true,
What
or
is
I
the
know
ultimate
this?
end all for saying something is true? Well, just me
Yeah,
saying it, I
because
guess.
you believe. I mean, if I say God exists, then does that mean He exists? So, like, it would be
I'm not
weird.
understanding the question.
I thought you just said that if you said it, I guess, is that what
Well,
you
you
said?
said, "What's the ultimate thing for me saying something that's true?" Well, it would be me saying
Yeah,
it,
like
right?
if I said right now, I said if I said God exists, and He's the ultimate criterion for knowledge, and He reveals things to me so that I can have certainty. Because I'm wearing a gray hoodie, why would that be wrong?
Well, you think that what the because is because the gray hoodie? Is that the reason you gave?
I'm saying that I could posit any possible reason for God being responsible for all this. Let's just say, and then I could say because I don't know, because God is immaterial or something like that. Like, where would you say that's correct or incorrect? Because
That
if I
you
looked you
know
dead in
that
the eye
God
and I said God
exists because
exists,
you're wearing a
if I
gray
said
hoodie. Is that the
if I said God exists because I'm wearing a hoodie right now, you'd disagree, right?
well? Yeah, obviously, one, I don't think God exists, but two, it can't be in virtue of the fact that you're wearing a gray hoodie. But I think from your perspective,
Why
I think
not?
you have to commit to that, though, don't you?
Well, why couldn't it be that me wearing the hoodie necessarily means me saying God exists is valid.
Well, because the thing about justification is, like I said, it's going to need to be some sort of like inferential relationship, and it's going to have to be explanatory, right? And there's
Explanatory.
nothing about
What's
a
the end of the explaining? Like, when do we hit the wall and say? Because I'm using God here, that He has infinite knowledge and reveals things to us. Otherwise, we could not know anything at all. Now, if you can know things apart from what I'm saying, I just, I just, I'm trying to figure out what it would possibly be. You could
yeah.
say
So,
I know things because of my senses, and then I say, "How do you know your senses are valid?" And you could say because of my senses, but I could still question that. You couldn't
well, but
question the
why?
infinite knowledge because that statement would need justify. If I ask you what's one thing you know and how do you know it, and you said, I don't know, the Earth exists or something like that, and I'm gonna say, how do you know that? And you're gonna probably say something like science or my senses. I'm gonna say, how do you know your senses are valid? And you asked me why a second ago, because sometimes the senses are fallible. So you answering with my senses exposes that you know when they are reliable and when they aren't, or at least have the capacity to. Because I could just say, well, I know God exists because He's sitting right beside me, and then if it's just senses, then you wouldn't have a refutation for that. So it has to go
Well, but
beyond senses.
if you're committed to saying like something like a concept circularity, like the example I gave where God is justifying logic, right? This is just
I don't think
concept
that's concept
circularity.
circularity.
I mean that's then you're just not understanding what concept circularity is.
Okay, so if we have a ultimate criterion for knowing things at all, we'd have to believe things, and we would actually have to have the capacity to know what is true or what is real. Uh, that criterion, the highest rung on the ladder. Do you believe that thing needs justified as well,
Do I
or that
think
you can't? Or
the highest thing on the ladder needs
yeah, I'm
justification of
saying
the
what I'm just asking is what is your ultimate criterion for knowledge? What is it? That's all. If it's not
so
God, then what else could it be?
so to before I'll answer that question because I do want to answer that one. But the first thing I'm pointing out is one, I don't think you're understanding what concept circularity is. If you don't think that what you did was concept circularity, that it definitely is. Like that's concept circularity.
Is
And what I'm
concept circularity
pointing out is that
fallacious?
if you accept that kind of circularity, then you're going to be committed to like anyone else can do it too. And with unless you have some kind of a symmetry break between the two, like say for instance, why is my concept circularity okay and yours not? Now, if you just say it's in virtue of God, then what'd you do? You begged
Because
the
mine is
question,
the
right?
because mine is the ultimate precondition for knowledge at all. The intelligibility, the ability to talk about uh, concept circularity. He is the highest criterion. He is the criterion of that. That's why I'm saying it would have to be self-justifying.
What if they
But I can.
believe logic is the highest criterion? Like that they're just saying, well, no, God isn't. It's in fact logic that's the highest criterion. My circle is a
Okay.
circle, your circle is
On
a
what
circle.
basis is
What's the
it?
difference?
Okay, so we're going to use
Well, it
logic. So
wouldn't need a basis, right? That was your whole point. If God is the highest, if God is
do
the
you want to take up
penultimate, the
that position?
final point, do I want to? No, that's I mean that's not my position. I don't accept circularity. You do, like
I know,
at
but
least I don't accept that kind of circularity. I think it's
I
silly.
know, but okay, that's fine. And you say we're not going to use logic, then that's fine. But
That's
what
not what I
is
said.
things, correct?
I
So
think I do. Yeah.
I know, but how do you know anything? That's what I'm really just trying to get at. I mean, at
Well,
least I
this seems
tried to
like you're
give you an
trying to
answer.
change the topic because all I'm doing is I'm pointing out that you're making this claim that you can only justify it on the worldview of God, but then you're wanting to talk
Am
about
I
my view.
right
I
or
don't
wrong?
mind. I talk a lot about my views, and I've given you several examples of my
I
views
understand,
about things.
but
But
am
at the
I
same
right or
time,
wrong?
I think you're incorrect, and the reason I
Okay,
think that is
on what
because
basis?
so on the basis that you're going to be committed. So if you say something like I'm
Like
going
if I
to
was
accept this kind of circularity here, and you're going to say, well, I reject your circularity because it's not the ultimate, but from their view, it is the ultimate. So what's the criteria? How do you go about rejecting
okay,
any other
that's fine.
view?
So we can never know anything at all then.
Well, that doesn't follow, right? That's not
Okay,
an
so if I
entailment of
was
that.
never
It just means that
born,
your view commits you to believing that atheists and
that's
lots of other views, tons of views, could suddenly know lots and lots of things
I know,
without
but
ever
we're
appealing
not
to
getting
God.
at how we're not getting at how you do know something. Then I mean, what the criterion actually is. We're just picking apart what I said, true or false. I mean, if I was never born, how I mean, how would you know anything? That would be the question. Like you know things, you've admitted, but how? How do you know? I mean, I don't have to be around
Yeah,
for this to even
but the
take
weird
place.
part is even if, say, hypothetically, I didn't have an answer that I think is going to be good for that question, right? Like, let's say hypothetically, I'm shit at philosophy. I got no clue, right? I don't know how I know things, right? Maybe I'm like that. I'm not, but at
If
the
that
same time, it
okay.
still wouldn't be informative to the question because the question that we're trying to answer is whether or not it's the case that you can know anything without God. Not whether or not I can know anything, but whether it's in
Can you know
principle
anything
capable
without
of
God? I
knowing
mean,
something about God.
if you say God doesn't
And
exist,
your
then you would
claim is
agree that
that you can't, right? And I'm giving
okay,
you an example of based on your views. So based on your view of like circularity, you accept certain types of
that's
circularity.
fine. We can
I've given
accept
you
that they're circular.
identical.
I'll just
Just a
concede
se-
that for a second.
if we could go one at a time, man, I'd really appreciate it. So you've given a type of circularity, one that is considered vicious by most everyone.
On
Called
what
concept
basis?
circularity. If you could just let me finish the statement, you
Okay.
can respond when I'm done. So you've given a type of circularity that is usually called vicious circularity. Now you're committed to believing that this is an okay kind of circularity, which I'm not going to sit here and tell you, oh, you can't use it or whatever. It's not informative. I do think it entails a contradiction, but at the same time, I'm going to for the moment work with it because what I'm saying is that if you are committed to that kind of circularity being okay, lots and lots of other worldviews can just insert the same sort of circularity very easily. Like for instance, I could base something on logic and reason. How do I justify logic and reason based on logic and reason? Well, why can you do that?
Yeah.
Well, because logic and reason are the ultimate thing, and it's going to be kind of
I don't
ridiculous
hear
because
anybody
that's where the
making that.
buck stops.
Right.
Um,
I don't hear anybody making that argument though. Like
well,
I
it
know
wouldn't matter
things.
whether or not they did. You would be committed to that view being the possible avenue to knowledge, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
That's
then
just an
I could
entailment from your
easily
position.
I could just refute them by disagreeing with them. That's the problem.
That's that's not a refutation. That's just disagreeing is not a refutation, right? So you're going
Well,
to
and I
need
could say
something
my
that's
ultimate criterion for
distinct.
knowledge is God because it's God, then yeah, no, God
Yeah.
this is not equivocal.
You mean equivalent? Equivocal is like is a semantic thing.
It's an
Um,
equivocation going on. That we're saying
you think
like
there's an equivocation between what terms?
conceptual circularity is vicious with God, and if we grant that it is vicious, uh, then the alternative would be, I mean, we could just make claims that we know things because of X, and how do you know X because of X? Well, then I could posit that I know God reveals things to me because God reveals things to me, and you couldn't refute that. That's why I'm saying. But my position that He grants us knowledge because He has infinite knowledge is not circular. The buck stops there.
I
I
think I,
mean,
I think that's a commitment that you have to have. Though you know things because God reveals things, but if God revealing things is the only way in which you know things, then you have to know that God reveals things to you because He reveals it to you, right? That's going to be a commitment you already have. So that's not going to give me an objection of any kind. So what I'm asking for though is that if or what I'm trying to point out is that if it's the case that the claim that you're making is way, the only way to have knowledge is via God. But you've given me
yes,
a tool that just it absolutely just allows so many almost every other view can suddenly just start begging the question all they fucking please. They can just say all sorts of like weird like, oh, I justify logic and reason based on logic and reason. Okay, well, coolio. Well, how do you, well, I can question that. I can just disagree with that. Well, yeah, you can disagree with it, but it's my ultimate. So it fits the criterion. So it fits the leg of the thing we were talking
yeah,
about is the
that you would
justification
admit.
leg. You would have to check off that's justified, right? Based on your view. Because if
It is,
your view is okay, then that one's okay because there's not a symmetry breaker. You need a symmetry
I
breaker.
think it is. I think it is. There is something asymmetrical about this. That
Okay. What
if
is
you
it?
say, like if I said, "Hey, how do you know X?" You said you come up and you say, "Hey, I know X." And I say, "How do you know X?" And you said, "Because of X." And I say, "Well, how do you know X?" And you say, "Because of X." Um, I mean, if you want, if the person runs with that logic, then they are the same person that would admit that the guy who believes God is the criterion for knowledge because he knows everything, uh, he wouldn't have a refutation for that. He'd say, "Oh, you're just as right as me." But the problem is the reason you can even demonstrate in a sort of conceptual way that my argument is concept circularity is because you know how logical circularity operates, and you're justifying calling mine circular, or excuse me, you're calling mine concept circularity uh, because you're loading up some presuppositions that concept circularity cannot be. You said concept circularity is vicious.
Hmm.
So I would suppose that
Well, not in your view though. Like,
you're going to
keep in
run with
mind,
the
I'm
laws of logic, and I would ask you, how do you justify the laws of logic then to call mine circular and therefore false?
well,
Like,
I'm granting that you're from your perspective that concept circularity is not vicious, right? So I'm just granting that from your perspective, but I
is it
don't think
vicious?
it's something you want me to grant. I don't think you want me to.
Is it, but is it vicious then? We're just is it
Yeah,
vicious?
I think it's problematic, and the reason it's problematic is because it entails a contradiction.
So
So,
contradictions are not allowed, correct?
well, contradictions are just like, yeah, there's it's just something that's what we mean when we say something's like incoherent, right? That's just like
So
in virtue of
you're
the
gonna
meaning of
appeal to
the
the
term.
laws of logic, on what basis?
So the idea is that, well, I mean, at least in my view, I don't even think that question makes sense. I don't think that you can like justify it. Doesn't it's not even meaningful to say something like justifying the laws of logic because they are
Right.
the method by which we justify things. So it's like you're at all your question demands that you beg the question, and then you're surprised when you've begged the question and when everyone else begs the question. My position's more like a sort of like a I just look at it and go, no, there's not something else that sits atop of it. You're sort of thinking that it's like a um, I just don't think like epistemically it makes sense to justify because justification,
Yeah,
presumably justification is going to be some sort of inferential relationship in most
I
views.
know, but why is it impossible that, I guess because if it's concept, circularity, then my argument that God reveals things to men so they know things for certain and he has infinite knowledge, if that is, inevitably conceptually circular, um,
Mhm.
then you're saying it's wrong, correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think essentially every view, when you attempt to answer that question, when you say, "Let me justify the laws of logic" or something like that,
How do you justify the
you're
laws of
going
logic?
but I'm telling you that you will all every you can plug in anything. You can plug in God, you can plug in unicorns, you can plug in your hoodie. Everything you can plug in there will fail because it will always be circular. And if circularity is non-explanatory, and what we mean by justification is to explain something, then you've presented an explanation that's non-explanatory. That's the
Why does it have to be
contradiction that I'm giving you.
explanatory? I mean, why does it have where are you getting that from? Why does it have to
Well,
be
are you
explanatory?
when you say you're justifying the laws of logic, what do you mean by that? If not, you're trying to explain the laws of logic. What else are you trying to do?
Well, that's what I ask you. Like, how would you justify the laws of logic? And I'm sure your answer was, I guess you don't really have to.
Well, it's
You could
more
just
than
plug in
that.
anything.
It's more than that. You don't have to. It's significantly more than that. I actually think it's a category error. You're literally
You do
trying
not
to
have to.
apply a predicate
I don't have
to
to
something
justify
that
the laws of
fundamentally
logic.
can't have that predicate.
So we don't have to justify the laws of logic then.
Like I said, it's a category error to even attempt to do so. So any view that does that, so like your view attempts to do that, it will fail in virtue of that. Yeah,
Okay.
so, like,
So the
it's
laws of
just gonna
logic,
out
are they
it's gonna
unchanging?
outright be a contradiction, and if you reject from your view, if you reject contradictions, do you agree that your argument, like, um, the argument you gave, if God exists or like, I gave you the example argument, if that's what you're trying to say was, if God exists, then he's revealing, to us, like, the laws of logic in a way so that we can know and trust our reasoning, right? 'Cause premise 2, God exists, therefore conclusion, we can know that, um or sorry, God is in fact revealing to us in such a way the laws of logic that we can use reason, something to that effect, right? This is going to be
Yeah.
circular. Circularity is non-informative. Explanations are informative. So you have offered an explanation because that's what justification usually means is to explain something, and it's non-explanatory. So you have a contradiction explained and not explained. You agree that that follows as a contradiction, and from your view, if you reject contradictions, then your view fails on its own sword. Do you agree that
Okay.
that
So do we
follows?
have if we have to justify the laws of logic? Do we have to do that?
Like I said, I think that that's a category error. So no, it doesn't even make sense to ask someone to do that. It's
Okay.
like
So if I
it's
said
just a
God exists
not a
because he
meaningful
doesn't,
statement.
what would be wrong with that?
What is it?
If I said God exists because he doesn't, what would be your refutation of that? I
Well,
don't
that
have to
it's a
just I don't have to.
contradiction, and
In
I
fact, you say that I'm using concept circularity, but apparently I don't have to justify the laws of logic. So I could just
no,
make the
it's
claim.
worse. Like I said, it's worse than that. It's not just that you don't have to. It's that in virtue of the fact that you attempt to, your worldview will fail.
Where are you getting the laws of logic from?
You don't get them from they're not this derivative thing, right? Like if they're do you think that like the laws of logic are some kind of like dependent relationship, like they're dependent on something, and if so,
If
why would they be
logic
dependent on something?
if logic deals with things that exist, then and you use logic, then I would argue that you know what exists. The question is going to become, how do you know what exists?
How do I know what exists? Well, I think that that one's
Yes.
an a priori sort of knowledge. I don't think
Okay,
it's
how
not
do you
like a
know that?
discoverable thing or something like that.
Okay, but that is not an a priori knowledge claim that it's a priori. Like, how would you know that then? I mean, because now you're
Wait, you
introducing
think
another
that
knowledge claim.
the knowledge that something is a priori is not an a priori knowledge claim? Why? Why would that
I
need to be an a posteriori? Because you've got either internal view, you got the a priori just means something internal, like it's going to be something in virtue of meaning, or you've got a posteriori, which is not in virtue of meaning, which is just saying it's coming from something external, like it's going to be discoverable, those sorts of things.
yeah,
Why on earth would you ever commit yourself to that? That is going to be a really bad way to go. You think that the knowledge of a
I
priori
probably
knowledge is
wouldn't.
a posteriori?
I probably wouldn't, but I wouldn't say that because when I ask you I'm just trying to get an answer. Like, how do you know anything? And then you're going to say, respectfully, along the lines of, um, I don't even know why. Well, you have an answer. I can't even characterize it. Like, what is one thing you know, and how do you know it? If we can
Well, I just want to get
show
to
another
the
criterion for knowledge than God, then let's do it.
sure.
And
There, I mean,
we can
there's
compare criterions in the end.
sure. I don't think it's going to even really matter whether or not we compare my specific personal view, though, right? Like the claim is stronger than that Tart can't have knowledge, right? Or that Tart can't justify it. I might be just stupid and I suck at this stuff, but it's that in principle no one else can do it. But what I'm asking for is a concession on 2 points that I think are absolutely defeaters for your position. And this is the negation of the proposition from the beginning of our conversation. The proposition being that the only way to have knowledge is with God,
Hmm.
and I'm giving you a direct defeater for that position, right?
What is the
Um,
contradictor here?
so the contradiction is that on your view, the way in which you have knowledge via God is going to be something about God justifying things like the laws of logic. Justifying the laws of
Okay,
logic is
so
going to entail a contradiction, and from your own personal view, contradictions are
so
not
God
something that's allowed.
is not the ultimate criterion of knowledge because of how I got there, or is he
Well,
just
no,
not
not
the
how
criterion?
you got there. It's that
So he could be.
essentially God wouldn't if your criterion for having knowledge is going to be something about justifying the laws of logic, and God can't do it, then you're committed to saying you just don't know things, right?
That would, yeah, but the problem is we do know things. So it's going to
Well,
require some criterion, or you could just say I don't know anything for certain, or I don't know anything at all, and I wouldn't make that position.
okay, so which part of what I'm saying do you disagree with? Do you think it's the case that you have that the position, the circularity that you gave doesn't entail a contradiction in the way that I said? Or do you agree that it entails a contradiction and therefore you should reject it? What
It's a
part of that are you
contradiction
disagreeing with?
if it's a contradiction if it is not the criterion for knowledge. If it is, then it's
What?
self-justifying.
That's gonna be again circular though. So,
Well, if you want
um,
to posit that your senses are the ultimate criterion for knowledge, and I say why, and you say because of my senses, that's fine. But I will be able to point out why that is not the case.
okay, so you're granting that it is a contradiction if it's not the ultimate. So you're fine as long as it's
Correct.
the ultimate criterion.
Right. If it's like a few rungs down, then it would be a contradiction. It'd be circular reasoning. But if it is the
Okay.
criterion of knowledge, then it is self-justifying. And I think you would have to concede it is self-justifying. Otherwise, you would have to disagree that it's not the criterion, which you didn't say earlier.
Well,
So
so I don't actually think that something can be self-justifying. I think that's just an absurd concept because it's not gonna, again, it's gonna be that's gonna be again the same. That's gonna be
damn.
premise. That's just premise circularity, right? So premise circularity is just going to be ridiculous. Like that's just like, but you are committed to some versions of premise circularity. I think that's a problem for your view as well. You're definitely going to
I
be
am.
committed to
They're
like,
absolutely they are vicious if it is not the criterion of knowledge that we're talking about. If the
okay, so
criterion
as
of
long
knowledge
as someone
is,
says, well, what are the criterion of knowledge? The laws of logic. How do you
I
justify the
say
laws of logic? Laws of logic.
the way out of
If you go
the
ahead.
way out of the circle for the criteria. So if you're going to call the criterion of knowledge God, if He is the ultimate criterion of knowledge, and that is concept circularity, the way out of it of the vicious circle is if you are the criterion.
Okay, so
That's my
logic
argument.
is so from someone's view, logic is the criterion. How do we dissociate God from the laws of logic such that the laws of logic I can't do the whole well the laws of logic are right because the laws of logic the laws of logic how do I justify the laws of logic by the
You
laws of
couldn't
logic?
divorce them because God essentially is and is the origin of the laws of logic because He created the universe, which logic deals with things that exist. If
No, no, no.
nothing
I
existed,
mean the views. I mean the views. So I'm giving. It's called a parody view. So I'm giving you a parody. This parody is using the exact same format you're using, right? So the format is going to be something about using the thing, using the concept to justify the concept, and then using the premise to justify the premise. You're going to be because you're going to be committed to both of those things being okay under certain conditions, specifically the condition that it's something about the ultimate. Now, from this hypothetical view, the laws of logic are some sort of ultimacy to things, and so they justify the laws of logic based on the laws of logic. um, how do they what do they appeal to other than that? The laws of logic are ultimate. They don't appeal to anything other than the laws of logic. Why would why would you say that like what would you say to this view? Because if you don't have some objection that if it's just oh well it's just circular. Okay, cool. You're fine
if
with
they say the
circularity.
laws of logic
Well
are the criterion,
it's
I'm going to ask them. I'll ask you: Are the laws of logic uh, material or immaterial?
I don't see why that's relevant. Like I
I'm
don't
going to
ask that.
prove that the laws of logic are essentially are God because you're going to admit they are unchanging, immaterial, spaceless, timeless, apply to everybody universally. And so, in your
Wait, you
position,
worship the laws of logic?
I'm saying they are necessarily the qualities that God has. You can reject. Go ahead and reject any of those. Say it's material, or say it does change. You believe what I just said. You have to.
I don't believe that like so you're telling me that if I believe in the laws of logic, then I've believed in God this whole time. So anyone who believes
Exposes
in the
that you
law of
know
identity,
God
the law of
exists. Yes,
non-contradiction, and the
because
law
it's not.
of
Yes, it exposes that you know God
that is a
exists because
ridiculous view.
it exposes you know God exists because it's what's more ridiculous is trying to justify using that as your criterion and then saying all you believe in like the natural world, like naturalism or something. That would be even crazier because it would
So
expose that
do
you're
you
not a
think that
naturalist.
the laws of logic are a conscious entity of some kind?
I believe they are laws that speak about existence that are unchanging and immaterial. Um, yeah,
But are they conscious?
no, they're necessary properties of creation that God made. If you don't buy in, if you don't actually believe what I'm my conclusion there, you'd have to believe that the universe was never created. Like
Well, this isn't making sense.
because
Are the laws of logic identical to God, or are they not identical to God? If they're
sh-
identical to God, and you
yep,
hold
they
that
are.
God is conscious, then
Sure.
the laws of logic are conscious. So you think the laws of logic are literally they're conscious?
I believe they are like kind of like uh, descriptive qualities of creation itself. Like you can't have laws of logic if nothing exists. So it's
So
a
you
kind of
think that descriptive qualities of creation are conscious?
no, they're not
Okay, so then they
conscious.
can't be identical to God, right? You said that they're identical
Okay,
to
then
God.
then they're not identical to God, but they were
Cool.
created by God by proxy of creation.
So you think that prior to creation, a thing could be itself and not itself at the same time?
No, logic would not even exist if things did not if nothing existed.
Well, yeah. So what I'm saying though is that you would be committed to saying if logic it just isn't a thing. I don't even think that that's actually meaningful. But let's say it's not even a thing, right? Then it could be
I
the
wouldn't
case
say
that God was both God and not God at the same time until God decided to establish that he was God, and then once he established that he was God, he created the laws of logic.
no because they apply to things that exist and God exists, therefore he cannot exist and not exist at the same time.
Okay, so then it couldn't be the case that he created the laws of logic, correct? Because there was never a point at which the laws of logic wouldn't exist or
They
apply to
kind of
God.
they would have to emanate from him unless you want to unless you want to say nothing was ever created, then you can't use the laws of logic anymore. Like because they would just kind of be meaningless. Like if they don't deal with created things or things that exist, um, then what are we even talking about?
Well, it
Really,
wouldn't just deal with created things either. It would still deal with God. Like for instance, like you said, God could not exist and not exist at the same time, correct?
laws of logic like are they're like God. They're immaterial. Uh, they're identical. I mean, they're identical to God.
Okay, we just went through why that's false, right? So like if you don't hold that if you hold that
They're
the laws of
qualities of
logic,
God.
well, you
Consciousness is
hold
not one of them.
wait, you think that God is not conscious?
Even if I said the laws of logic were conscious, what would your refutation be?
Well, I just find it peculiar to say it. It wasn't necessarily that there's like a. I'm not going for
Okay,
a refutation there. I'm asking you. You think that God is conscious, right?
I'm saying God is existence itself,
But is
and
he
so
conscious? Is he a like a mind?
yeah, he's conscious. Yes,
Okay, so you think
just
that
because
God is
I'm talking
identical to
about
the
your
laws of logic,
just because I'm talking
and
about your
you think
steering
that
wheel
God
does
is
not mean I'm referring
conscious.
to your
So
entire
you
car.
think well, just a second. Let me give you the full thing because it's gonna be really weird when you get down to the end of it. So if the you think that God is identical to the laws of logic, and you think that God is conscious, that is, God has the predicate consciousness. So it's the case that you think the laws of logic are conscious.
Sure.
Do you agree?
Yep.
You
I'll
think they're
agree with that then.
conscious. Well, you
Sure.
defined them earlier also as an
What's wrong
aspect,
with
like a
that?
description of reality, and then you also said that is God an aspect or description of reality?
He is reality.
God is reality. So you're more like a pantheist or something like that.
No, he created everything.
Well, God is reality, which means he couldn't have created everything if he is it, right? Because he would have to be creating himself, and
I
that just
believe
sounds
everything
ridiculous.
emanated from him. That's what I would believe about that. He
Well,
created
what I'm
everything.
asking
Like
is,
when you
so the
create
so the
something.
problem the problem I'm pointing to here is that if you think that the laws of logic are identical to God, God is conscious, and it's the case that also God is like, or like the laws of logic are like an aspect of reality, right? They're like a description of reality or something to that effect. Then you think God is a description of reality. But if that's the case, then God couldn't have created reality because you said God is like identical, like he is reality essentially. It's like, well, wait a second, but that's just gonna mean God created himself, and that sounds ridiculous.
Okay, so how do you account for logic then? Uh, if
Like
you
I said, I think you're in error for even asking such a silly question because I think it's a category error. That's not even
okay, that a
meaningful.
category error is a function of logic. So how do you account for that?
Well, so that's
It's
that's
like
the thing
I
is
don't
I'm
have to
saying
defend
that you're
that because it's a
trying.
category error. Well, that's using logic right there. So
Yeah, and
where do
I
you
think
justify
you're
logic?
I think you're in error for attempting to justify logic. It's not going to be the case that there's going to be
Okay,
like
if I don't
a
have to,
meaningful way to do so because any answer to it, you can plug in
if there's
anything
no
and it's
meaningful way
going to
to
be
do so,
non-explanatory.
then everything you
Dude,
just
could
said
you
about my
man,
logic about
man,
God,
you keep interrupting me, and I do try to listen, but I'd really appreciate if maybe you could give me the same kind of courtesy I give you when I'm trying to say something.
yeah,
Um,
but I don't critique your stuff about logic and then go and say it doesn't have to be justified. Like that's
I mean, you can.
that is conceptually circular. Well, that's what you just did, but then you said you don't have to justify logic, but you just went off for 10 minutes about how my logic about God, what logic is, was like logically incoherent. And then the
Yeah,
next thing out of your mouth was we don't have to justify logic. So it's
yeah,
like
we
I
don't.
have
I
to,
don't
but
think
you
you
don't have
can.
to.
No,
Okay, if
I
you can't
no, I
justify
said
logic,
no, I said
okay.
specifically, I think you're wrong to attempt to do so. Now, within your view claims that you have to do that, right? That's your view. That's your own personal commitment, not mine. I think that's your view. You shouldn't try to do that, right? I think that's just a mistake. And that's why you're
What
falling on why your view will fall on its own sword is if you try to do so.
try to do
Um,
what?
so it's not try to justify the laws of logic. I think it just sounds like a ridiculous. It's just it's not even a meaningful concept.
Well, I mean, they do exist, right? I mean, there are some things we cannot possibly say, like God exists and doesn't exist at the same time. So,
Well, saying something's meaningful doesn't mean it stands atop some other alternative justification, right? So, like, if I say God exists, God doesn't stand atop some other justification from your view. So, it's not the case that something to be like meaningful requires that it stands atop something else, right? That's just not a criterion for meaning.
if God is not the criterion for knowledge, then what is?
So, are you asking what I think it means for you to have knowledge? I think it's justified true belief. By
Okay,
justification, I use
true.
I
How do you know
I
what's
lean in
real?
favor of a few different theories. So one of them is coherence theory for
I don't
justification
care
for
if it's
most things, but
justified.
I'm kind of
I
a
don't care if it's
pluralist.
justified. I'm asking you to tell me how do you know what is true? If it's just justified true belief, it requires you to know or have some faculty that can identify what is true and what isn't. And where do you get that from?
Wait, I thought you were asking me how we know anything.
Yeah, how do you know what's true?
How do I
How do you know what's real?
know
How do you know what's
what's
real?
true? Well, how do I know what's true is going to be in virtue of things like justification if justification is an aspect of knowledge.
Okay,
Do you
does
agree?
justification does that have to be true?
Do I think the justification itself has to be true?
Yeah, you're saying the
So
justification has to be there, And I'm saying, well,
Yeah, it's got to be
first
the
it would,
correct justification, so it's got to be reason giving
right? It has to be the
for
correct
the
justif How
belief.
do you know when it is the correct justification versus when it's not?
Sometimes I think that I mean, like, are you trying to like refer to something like Gettier cases or something like that?
No, I'm saying,
What's the reference?
say if somebody wants to say that knowledge is justified true belief, they're saying it's correct justified. I'm exposing that they are loading up that there are such thing as correct justified to begin with, versus as opposed to incorrect. So that's why I just kind of threw that aside and said, let's just talk about what's real, because justification is a function of something that's real. So how do you know what's real in your worldview?
So I think I think maybe you're not. I mean, you're not making sense as a question. Can you like nail down what the question is? How do I know what's real? Is that it? That's the
Yes.
question. How do I know
Yes.
what's real?
Yep. That's
Um,
that's a question.
so in my view, I think that the best thing to do is use what's called um, it's just phenomenal conservatism. So essentially, the idea is um, justification is going to be something like prima facie justification, right? And that's going to be an aspect of knowledge. So when we're knowing
So if
what's
honest,
real,
uh-huh.
you always have to focus on the justifications, knowing what's real. So, for instance, I'm going to be something like, um, do you know much about phenomenal conservatism? Have you ever heard of it before?
Is it something that links into like perception, hard perceptionalism, or
So it's going to be something
like
like essentially the way
perceive?
in which we justify our knowledge of things is going to be that we have this prima facie justification. I'm prima facie justified in believing the seemings of the way in which things appear to me given my experience, right?
Okay.
Um, then then there's another step. So if I find a defeater for those seemings, that's going to be the time where I'm no longer justified. So I am at the first step justified in believing it. Um, if I find a defeater that tells me that it's in fact not true, then I would be justified in rejecting it and therefore
That
believing things are
defeater,
not true.
that defeater would not be prima facie, right?
So the defeater can be it can be a number of different, and I don't know how a defeater would be prima facie. Prima facie just means in it's a tentative thing. So I think knowledge is tentative. I don't think it's like certainty. I don't think it has anything to do with certainty. I think that's if you commit yourself to something like Cartesian certainty as a criteria for knowledge, you're going to commit yourself to nihilism, which was my point when I mentioned that God knowing everything, having a full knowledge of everything, he couldn't in principle make you know things without making you know everything if you hold to like certainty being a quality of knowledge.
I mean,
Um,
unless he's doing what we're doing right now. Like I'm not telling you about my girlfriend's dog, but you are learning things from me as we talk, but not everything else in my life. I don't think that's exclusive at all.
yeah, but then there's not really a reason that you would need God to know everything either,
If
right?
you
So
argue that
there's
God
not.
is not like that, but you couldn't because you don't believe in him. So it could be what God is doing theoretically. As I guess an agnostic approach would be, it's a possibility. He could be revealing things to me. Um,
But you wouldn't know those
not
things. They wouldn't be knowledge under the view that you gave.
no, I mean, Joe. He would just be revealing things to me. I
But
mean,
that wouldn't be the revelation of it wouldn't be knowledge.
I say he makes me believe certain things. That way, I can actually cohere the universe. Otherwise,
Yeah, he
you
makes you
couldn't.
believe things, but you don't really have like the justification. Like you're demanding that I explain how I
The
justify things. How
justification
do
is
I
if
know
he
things?
didn't,
And
if he didn't, then you could not know anything at all.
well, but that's the claim in question.
Okay, so how if that's not what's going on, then how is it? And you said you take things prima facie on their face,
Hmm.
first face actually. Um, so basically, I guess your perception of reality is how you arrive at knowledge, correct?
I'm sorry. Say again for me.
So basically, I ask you like, what is one thing you know, and how do you know it? You'd make some claim and say, I know it prima facie, right?
Yeah, well, I would just go with like really simple things. So, like for instance, I'm going to know something about like the fact that I'm experiencing things, or and that's just going to be that's going to be more of like a because like I said, I'm
So if you experience something, does that make it real?
the experience of the thing does not make it. Well, the experience itself is real, of course, yeah, but that doesn't make the thing being experienced like an object in itself or something like that. If that's the question.
Okay. So if what you're not saying is something like, so tell me how would this work then? Somebody comes in front of you and they've got 100 hats on a table. Uh, and in the back of the room, they've got a table sitting there with a hat on it, just one hat. They pull a rabbit out of all 100 hats, and then would you would you say the last hat would have a rabbit come out of it?
Yeah, I don't think I would have a good reason to believe that the last hat would have a rabbit in it, not unless I'm thinking that I'm
I
like
know,
at a
but then
magic show or something.
that is the prima facie. That is on its face. So you would believe rabbits come from hats, right?
No, that's not prima facie. Prima facie is just like it would be if he pulled a rabbit out of the hat and I experienced him pulling a rabbit out of the hat, I would be justified in believing the case that he pulled the rabbit out of the hat, unless I had some kind of a defeater. Like if I had a reason to believe that either that wasn't a rabbit, it wasn't a hat, or the rabbit didn't in fact come out of the hat, it came out from its sleeve or something to that effect.
Yeah,
Those would be defeaters.
somebody'd have to give you some sort of reason, and that reason itself would not be prima facie. So, um, when you say that there's something else, I'd have to find some kind of defeater. It's like, okay, why? I mean, you couldn't have just known it from looking at it,
Well,
like the
that's what I just said. Is that's in fact how you do know things. Is you're going to know them. You're just going to know them in virtue of what
I,
you're like
when I
you're
say
prima facie justified in
yeah,
believing the things that you're experiencing, that they're
right.
veridical, that they're real, until there's a good defeater. Like for instance, as if I look out my window and I see that the Earth looks flat to me, it seems to be flat. I'm pretty high up in the say if I'm on the 24th floor of a fairly high building in a roughly flat location, comparatively speaking to the rest of the world, I might be justified prima facie in saying, "Oh, hey, look, the world looks flat." And then I go, "Okay, cool. So, do I have reasons to believe the Earth isn't flat?" Well, someone else is going to give me some pieces of information, like, "Okay, here's pictures from NASA. I trust NASA. I think that NASA's a pretty good they're a pretty good organization. They say they went to space. Okay, I think that they did go to space. Here's a picture of the Earth from space. Okay, cool. So I agree with the picture that the Earth is
How
in
do you
fact
know?
not flat, and I'm just wrong that when I looked out at the world, it just looked that way, and now I have
How
a
do you
reason to know why it looked that way too.
right? So, how do you know that those are pictures of the Earth then? Unless you're building in some sort of presupposition, like that's
Well,
not prima
why would I need
facie,
to build in any sort of presuppositions for the justification I just gave?
because then you would just trust whatever I gave you.
That doesn't follow.
Why not? Why not just trust me?
Well, because I mean, I literally gave you like the reasons why. Like I
I know,
gave
but
you all those reasons.
those aren't defeaters if they're just coming from someone else. Like I could say, here's a picture
If
of
you're just
God.
asking for further justification, if you're asking if I think that there are further justifications, like that there are reasons, for instance, that I trust NASA, yeah, I think there are reasons why I trust NASA. If that's the question, I just don't think that I don't think that you're really responding to anything I'm saying though when you
You have
say that.
faith,
Like,
right?
no, well, that wouldn't be among them. No, I think
You
there's
just
actually some good rational
mhm,
reasons to
you
think that
just trust.
they're right.
Okay. So if I held up a picture of God, would you say that that's God? If it's prima facie.
Presumably, if you held up a picture of God, I would die if the Bible's true, right? That would be you can't look at the face of God. That's part of the Bible. So if you showed me a picture, I would have a direct defeater. Hey, you're a Christian.
If
You believe this is the Christian God, but you believe God has the quality that if I see His face, I will die. So I would have a defeater for that picture being God, right?
if I said here's a picture of a God that if you look at him you won't die, would you trust me on its surface or
Again, that's going to contradict your view. And so I mean, like I would be like, okay, well, I think you're lying because that's going to be
okay?
contradictory to your own view.
Okay, here's a picture of a six-sided triangle. Would you believe it?
I think that can operate. No, that's false.
Yeah, that's not prima facie. So, um, I guess if you know
Wait,
things
why
through
is that not
experience,
prima facie?
because it's directly in front of you, like it's the a priori meaning a to or ante priori meaning prior. Like this is a presupposition you've just introduced, not prima facie, which is you
What
loading up no
presupposition that
presuppositions.
what presupposition did I
That is
introduce?
a priori. I
That's
mean,
not a presupposition that something is a priori. That's just like a definition of something, right? Because when we're doing definitions, that's like just definition.
okay,
Like
so
you can hold something up and say this is a triangle and it has six sides, and I can go, well, you're what you just said, like the terms didn't you're like they didn't correspond.
right,
Like
so
triangles
it's
just
not
mean
prima facie.
somethings with three sides, right?
Right, it's
That
not prima
connect.
facie. You don't know things based
Wait,
on
why
their
do you think that
face.
that's not prima facie?
I'm saying you that's not what you yourself do not believe that, because if you did believe things just on their face, then there'd be lots of things I could I could show you, and I mean, you'd believe. You have some other criterion for determining if the prima facie thing is BS or not.
Well, the position is not just believing just anything on its face. It's believing specifically the seemings, the way in which something seems to me, and it does
Why?
seem to me to be the case that what I mean by a triangle is something with three sides. So that is prima facie, right? So if I had a defeater for like the fact that maybe I'm wrong about what I mean or my intentions in some way. I don't know how you could offer that to me.
You
Supposedly,
just I could
you
just
know,
say triangles
here
have four sides.
maybe I'm gonna grant maybe it's possible that there is a way to have a defeater for my own intentionality around the term. And so for that, that is prima facie. That's still just what I mean when I say prima facie. I'm still trusting the way in which things seem to me. It's just about my own intentions around the
The way they
term.
seem. So the problem is when you say I know things through experience, which I wrote this down. That was your answer. Like you know practically anything through experience. Um,
That's not what I said. I'm not committed to the only way you know things is like what I said is the thing that I can know is my own experience, not the
how?
thing that doesn't follow that that means the only way that
No,
I
how?
know things is
Okay.
experiencing them. That's going to commit me to something like everything that I know is going to be a posteriori, and that's just
But
silly.
what is just one thing you know, and how
I
do you
gave
know
you
it?
the example. I think I know that I'm experiencing.
Okay, and how do you know? And not that I think I know. You can't be wrong about something you know. I mean, what is one
That
thing
doesn't
you know?
follow. Like I said, I reject Cartesian certainty as a criterion of knowledge. That's just false, right? If you commit yourself to that, Barnaby, I'm going to show you why that's a contradiction, and you're going to end up in an epistemic nihilistic position.
It's just okay. See, so you think you know it, but there could be a chance that you don't. Is that correct?
That's the prima facie portion.
So
Everything is prima
exactly,
facie.
your entire worldview would operate on the premise that you only think you know things, and
That
therefore they
that
could be incorrect. And if that's the case, then all of
the
your knowledge
possi-
could be incorrect. Correct?
Are you committed to the position that in order to know absolutely anything, you have to be infallible, Barnaby?
No,
Are you committed to that? Okay, so if it's the case that I grant this, what the fuck would it have to do with anything?
it would mean that you could be wrong
It
about
wouldn't mean
everything you claim to
anything.
know. Could you be wrong about everything you claim to know?
I think it's unlikely, but it's possible. There's not like a contradiction
Okay,
from it.
if it's possible that you could be wrong about everything you know, then it follows logically that you don't know anything.
That doesn't follow. Like I said, Cartesian certainty is
I'm
something
afraid it
I
does.
reject.
If I
What
asked
you
you what's
just
the
said,
speed limit on that road out there,
Barnaby, let me respond. What you just said is that Cartesian certainty is true. So if you believe that you must have certainty about the things that you know, Barnaby, you are an epistemic nihilist because I need you
okay,
to give me a reason why you I need you to give me a reason really quickly here for how you're going to account for knowledge in the certitude sense. How do you do it? Because you're
so
going
what
to
is
need
your
to know God with certainty. You're going to need to know all of your experience with certainty.
so what
You're
is
going to
your
need to know
ultimate
everything with certainty. Otherwise, none of it's knowledge
those
from
are
your
a lot
view.
of absolutes. So what is your ultimate claim against me here then?
That Cartesian certainty entails epistemic nihilism.
You could be wrong about that then, correct?
It's possible, yeah. There is
Okay, so
always a
you don't know it.
possibility. That's
It
not
could
a
be the case
defeater.
that
That is
a
your view
defeater
that
is
means I don't know it.
no,
That's
the
your view.
defeater
That's the
is it
opposite of
could be
my
the
view.
case. The
That's not
defeater
a
is
defeater. That's
okay,
not a
could be
defeater.
the defeater is it could be the case that your
No,
description of it is incorrect.
that's not a defeater. No.
You said
A defeater is a way in which you can know it's actually false. Not that it could
okay,
be false,
but you
that
can't
it's
account for that
actually
anymore
false.
because you said all of your knowledge could possibly be wrong. So any
Yeah.
refutation I give you is sufficient.
Yeah, you don't but I don't think that I like are you understanding that Cartesian certainty can't be a criterion of knowledge and that you
I'm
will be an
understanding that you could
epistemic
be wrong
nihilist?
about that. So any rejection you make now is just
So?
you could just be wrong about.
Wait, are you an infallibilist, Barnaby? Yes or
Uh,
no? Are you an
what is that?
infallibilist?
What is
It
that?
means that you're right about everything.
Nope.
Everything you know is with certainty.
Sure, I'll take that position. Let's
Do
do
you
it.
think you know everything with certitude?
Yep.
I think you're just an egoist at that point. That's just weird.
That's not an
I don't have.
argument. That's an ad
I don't
hominem,
even. I
which
don't
you could be
even
wrong
feel. I,
about.
I'm just gonna be real with you, Barnaby. I don't actually feel. I don't feel the need to take someone who actually thinks they know everything
It's because you could
and
be
they are
wrong about
certain
everything.
about absolutely everything.
Right.
So you've never been wrong your whole life ever.
I'm for argument's sake, no.
See, that's
What's your
gonna be like now.
refutation?
Now I think you're just being dishonest.
No, it's
Are you gonna
dishonest
be
is when you
honest
make all
with
these
me?
claims and then say all of your knowledge could possibly just be wrong.
Well, that's
Because
that's just
now
being that is honesty. That's I would hope that anyone who is
that's
honest would
honesty.
admit that.
That's
I
honesty.
think that's honesty. Yeah.
Okay, you could be wrong about that too.
That's what I mean when I say
What's
honesty.
happened is
Yeah.
you've completely abandoned knowledge because you've admitted everything you know could be wrong, and so any refutation against your worldview would be irrefutable. So God exists because He doesn't. There you go.
Yeah, I don't think you're that one. I think you're kind
I
of
know,
being a
but I'm
little
going to
dishonest
punctuate
here,
it with
man.
you could be wrong about that.
I
That's the
I don't
point.
I don't I don't care whether you punctuate it one way or another, right? So I don't I'm
I
not I'm
know.
not interested in that. If you
What I'm
could
trying to
just let
show is
if remember how I asked if you could maybe like try to take turns. I'm trying to be polite and let you talk as well, but I do really
you're right.
appreciate when
I
people
apologize.
listen to. You can punctuate it however you want. I actually don't really care very much about it because I think that once you lie to me, Barnaby, because I don't think you believe what you just said, right? I don't think you actually believe that you've never been wrong about anything. And if your view is the case that like you have to be right about everything all the time, um, then you know that your view won't work. And I think that you know that, and I think you're just
Yeah.
being dishonest at that point. And
Well,
I
if
don't
your
and I and
view
I don't want to really I don't want to continue the conversation if you're going to be committed to dishonest things. And
right,
it's not out
because
of
the only
it's
way
not
you
out
can
of
continue the
like it,
conversation is, well, if you believe all that about me, um, what's more dishonest is to accuse me of those things and then also say that you could be wrong about everything you claim to know, or it's at least possible. That's even more dishonest. That's like saying, that's like literally believing like somebody is just like respectfully, if you called somebody mentally retarded, that's about how bad it is because this is the same person who says, Burnaby, you're being dishonest, disingenuous, but it's possible that I'm wrong about everything I know. So you're really just lying to me. I'm trying to offer
I,
that
where did
you
I
do know
lie? What was the lie?
that you could be wrong about everything you claim to know, that it's at least possible. I'm saying that that's not possible. It's not
Why?
possible if you, because if you couldn't even make that claim if it were possible. If it were possible that you're wrong about everything you claim to know, then that would be potentially wrong too. And if
Well,
that is
that's
potentially
just
wrong, then it would
fallibilism.
follow that you do know things. The problem is you do know things because God has revealed things to you so that you can have certainty at
Yeah, but I
all.
don't think you have certainty, so it would follow that God doesn't
Well,
reveal it to you,
if you
right?
don't
So
think you
like
have
so like
certainty,
just
that's
a
a
second.
certainty
Let
claim.
let me respond to it really quickly. From
That,
your view, if it's a requirement
ah,
that for you to know things, you have to know it with certitude.
yeah,
And
that's a
God is
certainty
revealing
claim.
every piece of knowledge you have, right? Everything you know is being
No,
revealed to Barnaby. I listened politely. Can you, for the love of fucking non-existent Jesus, can you listen?
that isn't my argument.
Yeah, well, this is the way I'm taking it. You can correct me afterwards, but wait until I'm done and then correct me. So
Okay,
if you're holding that in order to know something, it has to be with certitude. And it is the case that God is revealing everything to you, like for instance, your senses, it's revealing to you that you have an apple sitting in front of you. And it is the case though that you could be wrong. It might not be an apple. You might just be looking at it wrong, or it could be like, when you're driving down the road, it looks like there's a puddle in the road, but
absolutely.
it's not actually a puddle, it's just like a mirage or whatever. But you believe God's revealing everything to you.
You're
Everything is
right.
being revealed.
You're right.
You
That's
should have it should
yeah.
follow from your position that you'd have certitude about that. But if you're honest with yourself, if you're just going to
Right.
lie to me, I'm not going to continue. But if you're going to be honest, you're aware that that's not true. Like you are
I
wrong sometimes, and you have been wrong many times in your life.
you see,
And so it's not the case from your view then that God is
I guess
revealing things to you such that you can know them with certitude.
I guess the only problem with that is that's not what I believe.
Okay, cool.
There you go. There's the
Then what are you saying that's
refutation.
different?
You just rambled on about what I don't even believe that God reveals everything to you. That was a loaded
Oh,
straw man.
that's silly then. Okay. So what is it God reveals to you then? If not everything. I thought every piece of knowledge you had God revealed to you.
No, that's not what I said ever.
Okay.
I wouldn't even make a claim. So, if you could be wrong about everything you claim to know, then there is no. I can't prove anything ontologically or epistemologically to someone who could be wrong about who doesn't know anything. So, I mean, respectfully, if you can't know anything for certain, you said there is no certainty earlier, like 2 minutes ago. That is a certainty claim in itself. Um, that's what I'm saying. These are loaded presuppositional worldviews, mine and yours. The problem is I can justify them with someone who has infinite knowledge, which is God. You're only left with, that's possible. I don't know anything, and that there is no certainty, which is certainty in itself. So if you don't believe anything is certain, then there's nothing I can do to even convince you of anything anymore, because you can't know anything, and so you can't know if I'm correct or not. So I
Well,
just,
let's
and
start
if you
with
can't,
because I want to. I want to point out something. I'm sorry. Did I? If I interrupted you, you had
Oh, no,
more to
no, that
say.
was all.
I'll listen. Okay. So I want to point out that if it's the case that every piece of knowledge you have, God is in fact not revealing you really revealing each one of them to you, right? If that's the case, do you agree then that at least one piece of knowledge is not being revealed by God? That's just like tautological, right? Do you agree?
Brother, I'm telling you, like, I'm not trying to concede here anything here. Like, I'm just telling you, like, if you can't know anything, there's no point in debating anymore because
Yeah,
you
I don't
can't.
think
If
there's any. Like I said, I don't even think that's a quality of knowledge at all. So I don't like knowledge is justified true belief. Where does it say certainty in there?
hey, where are you justified in saying all of your knowledge could be wrong?
What
Where's the justification for that? Do
I
you
feel
know
like I'm
everything?
asking questions and you're answering my questions with questions, and I'm going like that's not going to be important. Like I don't think that that is a quality of knowledge because the knowledge we've agreed to was justified true
What
belief.
is
We
not
had
a
the
quality of knowledge?
certitude, like certainty.
Okay. So why make the claim that it's possible that all of your knowledge is wrong if that doesn't have to be a quality of it? You're saying it doesn't have to be, but then you jump out of the taxi and use it somewhere else. Like it's like okay, it doesn't have to here, but I'm going to use it like it does like 10 minutes ago. Is
Well, no, what I'm gonna say is I'm gonna give you the beliefs and the reasons that I hold those beliefs. I don't believe that those all of those reasons are like speaking with certitude. Now, if
I
you
don't
think
yeah.
it's the case that certitude is a quality of knowledge, I think that's gonna be kind of silly. But I want to focus on one thing because this is a defeater this is gonna be a problem for the initial proposition we were debating, which was that you can't have any knowledge at all without God. But you also said just a moment ago that there's at least some things that you know that are not being revealed to you by God. Do you agree that you did just say that just a moment ago?
Yeah, there are some things that God does not reveal to men
That
correctly.
are those things knowledge though? Some things that you know that God didn't reveal to you. He wasn't the one who did it.
Yes, because the way we know things is through our reasoning and senses. Those are the things he reveals to us so that
Okay,
our
so
tools
you would
are
agree
able to be
then
used. That's like God
if
giving
it's
you a
the
screwdriver and
case.
saying, "Hey, go learn some." Like if God gives you what's happening is God is giving you like a drill or a saw, and He's saying, "Go out and saw wood and drill screws." That's kind of what's going on.
So all I'm getting at is if it's the case that you have one piece of knowledge that is not revealed to you by God, and your initial claim is that without God you couldn't know anything. This is not the case that he's doing anything with this. You have the knowledge. That's just gonna be straightforwardly a contradiction as far as I can tell.
It may just be the way I'm wording it. Like I'm not trying to like be facetious here. I'm just saying, unless if God does not exist, you cannot know anything at all. And God reveals things to us so that we can use these tools called reasoning faculties and sensual faculties to learn things about the world and to develop beliefs about the world. That's all.
So what's the difference between saying something like, I know something that God didn't reveal to me. I have this piece of knowledge. God didn't do it.
Yeah, you
And
would have had to
saying
if
with
you do have that
I had
knowledge.
knowledge without God and without God's like anything to do with God. Like how what's the difference between those two statements?
It's not. It's worded incorrectly. It's not. I have knowledge without God. It would be I have knowledge without God revealing this specific knowledge to me. You
Okay.
can have
So
knowledge without God revealing like everything to you. The same way we can have conversations about epistemology, and you don't leave the conversation knowing everything about like real estate, like, which is what I do.
okay. So if God is revealing to you that you can trust your senses, then why is it the case that you can't trust your senses in the instance of, say, for instance, you see a puddle of water on the road and it's
Yeah,
actually heat?
God.
Like, if it's the case that God is revealing it to you in such a way that you can know that it's certainly true that you are in fact sensing a puddle of water on the road, and then you find
Right,
out that it's
when it's
wrong.
not actually there.
Mhm.
It is because God has made certain, has given you the ability to use your reasoning and sensual faculties properly, so that you can actually. It's actually the same way you can have error in the world. I would say that people have proper reasoning faculties all the time. It's just the information they're left with is incorrect.
But I don't see how that really answers the question. Like, if it's the case that you can in fact trust your senses, and God is this infallible being, so when He's revealing something to you, like that you can trust your senses, I don't see how there's any room for error from that, right? So like he's revealing it to you in this perfect way. and then somehow you get it wrong.
Yeah,
How?
you're not sensing anything wrong. The conclusion you come to is incorrect, but it's not even saying like you could even take the perceptualist account for this and say, well, there's a puddle here. There seems to be a puddle here. You would need to have proper sensual faculties to even know that it was there to say that it wasn't. Like, otherwise, you couldn't rely on your senses ever.
Well, it wouldn't even I wouldn't even need to say it wasn't. Like, it might be the case I never realized that I was wrong, right? I might go on for the rest of my life believing I saw a puddle of water, and it just isn't true, right?
Yeah, but does
So
that mean you did see a
I
puddle
don't
of
need
water?
to I don't need to know that it's wrong. So the question is if it's the case that God is revealing it to me in such a way that it's this perfect being, this perfect revelation, and that's the only way in which I know anything. And yet it seems to be the case that even this perfect revelation produces things that for whatever reason are so massively imperfect. It doesn't seem to me to be the case that you've really fixed the issue with any sort of sensory perception. If anything, you've created a new issue. And that new issue is that you seem to have inserted a perfect being that is somehow you still fuck up in virtue of his revelation. It's like, but how? Because if he's revealing it to you, then it
Because
shouldn't be the case that you should ever get it wrong.
the quote unquote fucking up is only possible if you can rely on your senses to begin with.
But you did
You can still come
that
to wrong
that's wrong.
conclusions. God gives you these puzzle pieces, but you put it together incorrectly. It's like, yeah, the only way you could see a mirage is if you can rely on your senses, of course.
No.
This doesn't mean you're
No, no, no.
infallible.
That's an objection to the reliability of your senses, not a reason to say they're reliable. So like it doesn't I don't ever need to know that I saw a mirage. I could go for the rest of my life believing I in fact saw an oasis in a desert. I was delirious and but I still believed it. And it's just false, right? I believe my senses are being revealed to me by God. But
Yep.
what's strange is that if my senses, the reliability of my senses is being revealed to me by God, and yet it's the case that my senses are unreliable, then it's not the case that God is revealing to me that they are reliable because they aren't reliable.
How do you know it's a mirage then and
But
not
you
real?
don't. That was the whole point. I go for the rest of my life never knowing it was a mirage. I thought it was true. I still believe it's true. I never knew it was a mirage. But in truth, in reality, in the actuality of things, it was a mirage. I just never knew it.
Right, and that would be incorrect, right? It means it was not a mirage.
Wait, you think in order for it to be a mirage, you have to know that it was a mirage?
No, in order to say in order to say the puddle wasn't real, you would have to know it was a mirage.
So wait, you seriously are committed to like this is what's called a metaphysical horse fallacy. So you're saying that there's this true thing that it is in fact a mirage. I'm completely unaware of it. I saw it, I believed it. I never learned that it was a mirage. But in reality, there's not
I'd
an
say you didn't.
oasis in the middle
Yeah,
of the desert.
I'd say you didn't know it.
Well, that's the thing in question. I'm wrong about it, right? So what I'm saying is if it's the case that God is revealing to me that I can trust my senses and I'm trusting them and they're still wrong, you got a problem on your hands. Doesn't that
This
sound like a problem? Like it
seeing a
shouldn't be the case
mirage.
that if God, there's this infallible being giving me the ability to trust my senses, and then here I am trusting my senses and I'm wrong.
Yeah, this ties into things like
That would be absurd.
intense intoxication or drug use. You know, that you'd be maybe, or even schizophrenia, that you'd be seeing things that just weren't there. Um, in fact, I would pose back to you: how do you know it even is a mirage when mirage assumes that the puddle perhaps didn't exist, but I thought I saw it? Um, why you call it a mirage, and then where where you find yourself with a schizophrenic or a severely drunk or high person on narcotics, they're seeing things that aren't there. The only way you could definitively tell them that those things, there's no demon in the room or something like that, or a purple dragon, is if you could rely on your senses to begin with, in which to call other interpretations of like visual faculties error.
Well,
Well,
what I'm
otherwise, if
pointing
you don't
out is
have to, then you can't tell them it's a mirage.
what I'm pointing out is that it makes perfect sense that there would be times where we could rely on them and times where they would fail. But if there's a God doing it in such a way that
Yeah,
it's perfect and that is revealing to us as
right.
perfect that we can rely on our senses, then
But the
it wouldn't
reason,
be the case they would ever be unreliable. But
but
they
the,
are at times
but
unreliable.
the
So
reason that
it's
we
not
can,
the case. Just listen to the full argument because I'm giving you literally premises and I don't think you heard the premises. So if it's the case that there is this God revealing to me in such a way that I can know for sure that my senses are reliable, then it shouldn't be the case that they should ever be unreliable because he's perfect and he's doing so in a way that they are reliable. But sometimes they aren't reliable, so it can't be the case that it's the God that's revealing it to me.
What do you mean by unreliable?
Sometimes they fail. That's all.
Okay. What do you mean they fail? Like
They
the thing
I
doesn't
look at
exist?
something, I believe that it is something based on those senses. It is false that that thing exists.
I know, but on what basis are you saying that the pond, the puddle, or the demon in the room and sort of schizophrenic is not? How do you know you're not just a schizophrenic? I mean,
That would just be another example of how of the way in which that shouldn't even be possible if there's a God. We shouldn't have any schizophrenics because they too would be having their senses revealed to them in such a way that they could not be wrong. If God's revelation is this like certitude, they should be having their senses revealed to them in a way that they cannot be wrong about something.
God
And yet it
revealing
is
it
the
to you
case
is not.
sometimes we sense things and we're just wrong.
Yeah, I would question how you would know you're even wrong there.
Well, they don't. They don't need to know they're wrong. It's just ontologically the case that they're wrong is all I'm saying. They
I
don't
know,
need
but
to know that they are.
how do you know that though? That's a
Well,
claim.
they don't need to know it. That's the point. Are you
I
not
know, but
understand?
if you,
Do you maybe repeat back the argument to me? And I just want to kind of shit test for a second. Do you even understand what I told you? What was the argument?
I'm saying in order to tell them there's no demon in the room, you would need to have valid sense faculties, or at least be able to rely on them. Correct?
There's, but you're not understanding the objection. They don't need to know that they're wrong. It just has to be the case that they are wrong, right?
I know. What does that
This
mean?
is a this is an objection to like if it's the case that God is revealing to us our senses are reliable in a way that we cannot be wrong about our senses being reliable because it's God's revelation and God is
That's
perfect.
not my. Well,
And
I don't
yet
believe
it's
that.
also the case if you could listen to the full arguments. And yet it's also not the case that I am always right about what I am sensing. So my senses are not always reliable. So it's not the case that God is revealing to me my senses are reliable because God couldn't do so and it be fallible.
Seeing something that's not there is not a violation of your senses. It's not saying your senses are unreliable. It just means you see something with your senses, and it turns out that that thing does not exist as a material manifestation. It doesn't mean just because God reveals to you certain things. I could back it up and just take senses out of the equation and just use reasoning itself. Now I've done that before, but I think the senses still fly here. I'm not saying God reveals uh, all sensory information to you infallibly so that you cannot ever like you couldn't even see a mirage or be a schizophrenic. I'm saying God gives you the ability to have senses in this world so that you can interpret how the world operates, by which you could even say the schizophrenic demon is not in the room or the pond is not actually there.
Well, it wouldn't even be relevant whether or not we could say it. That's not even relevant to the argument I made. Can you maybe try to repeat back to me the argument I gave? Because I want to see if you
I
even
don't
understand
understand
the
the
argument.
argument. I don't believe
Okay.
that this is a
Okay.
violation of fallibility.
Yeah. So if you're not understanding the argument, Um, it's pretty simple modus tollens. So the form is just going to take it's a conditional if then,
Yeah,
and then the it's not the case that the then therefore not the if. So if it's the case God is revealing to me that I can trust my senses, then it's also the case that I can trust my senses. I can give you at least one instance where I can't trust my senses because they're just wrong. So it's not the
how do you know
case
that?
then that God is
No, but
revealing
how
it
do you
to
know
me.
that? How do you know that they are wrong? You would need to
I
use
don't have
valid
to
senses.
I don't have to know like that the wrong maybe I could say something like because we're two people are sensing two different things and there'd be contradictory things or something like that. Like it would be something a priori,
Yeah,
not something a posteriori.
but
Um,
how
but
would you
that
know that?
wouldn't be that's not really relevant to the argument. If you agree, if you don't agree that we're ever wrong about our senses, like if you're actually committed that we are in fact never wrong about what we're sensing, I think that's kind of a really silly position. I don't know. I would find it a little dishonest, but like if you're committed
Sure.
to that, like the infallibility thing,
It's
I think
like
it's silly.
it's like somebody giving you like a Nerf gun. They give you a Nerf gun to use, and obviously you can shoot things with it. And it turns out you just sit on it. It's like the only way you could sit on it is if the person gave you the Nerf gun to begin with. Like just because I would offer two objections. One, how do you know the thing isn't actually real? And two, I forget what the second one was, but in order to say this is not actually, in order to say our senses are errored, you would have to say like I see like a puddle, it's not actually there, or I see a demon in the room. The demon is not actually there. That's wrong. I'm asking on what basis do you assume that that is wrong?
Well, I think that I think that our senses are reliable sometimes, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they fail. But from
When
your view, that shouldn't be the case, right? From your view, you have an infallible being who's
right,
revealing to you the reliability of your senses. If it is the case you have a being that's revealing to you the reliability of your senses, such that you cannot be wrong that they are in fact reliable, and I can give you any instance where they were not reliable, then it's not the case that there's this perfect being it's revealing it to you in such a way that you can't be wrong about it. Because you are in fact sometimes wrong about it, right? Now it makes perfect sense under my view, because I don't think there can be a perfect being revealing my senses to me that in such a way that they are
that's
perfectly
oh,
reliable, because
I
they're
gotcha.
not.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they are completely infallible. I'm saying they are reliable, which means you can trust them. Not that they
Well,
are
but
always
wait,
perfect.
I thought you were saying the kind of knowledge that God reveals to you is the kind that you cannot be wrong about. That's what you said before.
I just said he makes it so we can trust our senses, right?
Yeah, but if he's revealing something like that to us, and it's not the case that we can always trust our senses, right? Just saying, you will. I think we can trust them sometimes, and sometimes we can't trust them. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong.
If you
But
believe there
if
are
God's
errors,
revealing to it, and he's like this perfect being, and he's coming to you, and he's going, "Here's a piece of perfect knowledge coming from the Creator of the universe. This pristine, perfect knowledge that your senses are reliable. Here you go. Here's that revelation." What's
I'm saying it's more
peculiar is that it's
okay.
sometimes wrong.
I'm saying
Like,
it's
it's
more.
sometimes that they're not reliable. So the proposition that he's revealing to you is that your senses are reliable, but sometimes that proposition is false is what I'm pointing out.
It's more or less like would you say that reality exists externally to your mind,
Yeah, I believe, like, so
and
I'm
your
kind of like a
okay,
say again?
and you would say that your perception of reality exists in your mind, correct?
Mhm. Yeah.
I'd say that is what God is tethering together, not making it so we can't see things that aren't there, but that we can even sense this universe at all, uh, reasonably to even intelligibly do so would require some consistency, which you cannot get from naturalism, where everything is just
Well, I think
purposeless.
the objection that I'm
Decided.
levying here, and I'll let you have the last word, but I do have to end this after after this. This has to be kind of the end of the conversation because I do have to go. But I'll let you have the last word. I'll just explain my objection again, because what my objection is that what we would expect under a God view is that God has this perfect knowledge and He's revealing perfect knowledge to you, and he's revealing things like something like you can rely on your senses, and that proposition, you can rely on your senses, if it's from this perfect being, then it should be true under all instances. It's not true under all instances, so it's not coming from a perfect being. That's my point. But under atheism, this is exactly what we would expect, is that sometimes our senses would be reliable, sometimes they would not be reliable, sometimes they would help us survive, and sometimes they would mess up because we're not perfect at surviving. Those sorts of things are exactly what we would expect under the sort of system that I think is likely true, and just not at all what we would expect under your system. And so that was my last objection. I'll leave the last word to you, and then unfortunately, like I said, I do have to go.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'd say my last word here would be, um, you said that the atheists know when their senses are not. Excuse me. I would argue that atheists can never really make the case that their senses are reliable. In fact, they could just be some illusion. So the ability to critique the Christian worldview that, um, goes when you come up and say like, oh, well, if God reveals things to you so that you can know them for certain, how can you error in your senses? The problem is you have no basis to call them an error when the atheist position has no basis to call them reliable ever, because it could just be some illusion. And so you saying the demon in the room is not there to the schizophrenic, I think respectfully is just meaningless.